Okay, so LPL Brief. Time for another episode on jungling. Today, Condi was really not interesting. He was kind of boring. So I'm gonna talk about ZZR and the Snake versus WE set instead because I think overall there are some interesting points for Snake. There were fewer interesting moments in the games today, so I'm just gonna talk more generally about these jungle styles and things of that nature. Then I'm going to talk about Amy within the framework of LGD and also some of the interesting things that YOLO managed to do on Graves and why they worked against LGD initially. That talking about how LGD's jungle works, when I get to that, will answer a lot of the questions that people have been giving me about why are LGD suddenly getting better? Because I think the LGD jungle situation is really, really interesting. So, I'll get to it. Anyway, first thing that I'm going to talk about though is the Snake vs. WE series. CCR is a jungle I didn't mention in the last episode when I talked about the most interesting jungles, but I think CCR is actually a bit underrated, even by me apparently, because I think that he's a bit creative. It's also worth noting that he has a lot of first bloods, and Snake tend to get first blood pretty frequently, which means that he's a fairly active jungler in the early game, and he's effective. CCR, like Tren, likes to give up a lot of farm, and try to be more efficient with his lanes in this sense. So the first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is how in the second game, Condi was able to stay even with ZZR, even though Condi joined the push in the lane swap, and ZZR did not. Typically when you talk about lane swap scenarios, and something that I've already gone over is what happens here, is after we've already removed the first row of turrets on both sides of the map, you generally have a swap again, and the duo lane that was down here and took this turret will go top. The top laner will linger and take the end of the turret. Same thing here, except in the reverse. Generally, what also happens is your jungle will be pathing in such a way as to be on the strong side, so where the duo lane is. Which means that typically, if you're red side, your jungler will probably start up here and then path down here. Or if your jungler wants to be super safe, which is fairly common, he'll start here and path over here. Right? Because this makes sense since you're changing the way the jungle is farmed. Usually this means that this area will get cleared first or something like this, and so when the swap is reverted, the jungler has a free quadrant to farm wherever his duo lane goes. So then if this duo lane goes top, the jungler now, let's redo these real quick. Jungler now can farm up here because the camps have respawned. However, since Snake are often ahead in the tempo, what they'll do is they'll have their duo lane come down, take Krugs first, and then go back to the lane and start to push. Usually this is because whoever is playing against Snake is behind or doesn't have this lane, so they can get a little bit of extra greed here. This meant that in the WE versus Snake game 2, this jungle didn't have a lot of farm in it, and Condi was able to get a lot of extra farm relative to him, and then go and help bot. So there was not really any extra stuff for ZZR to get here, and he just kind of did nothing. So this is the first thing you talk about. Unfortunately, there was really no advantage taken by WE as a result of this. They just kind of won the game anyway, mostly off of Mystic, because there was a really dumb invade by ZZR in here, and by Snake in general. Just really bad coordination, not good vision, things like this. Overall, when you watch Snake's games, I think that one thing that's really, really underrated when we talk about lane swaps is how well the jungle paths to stay even or to stay around the solo lane or to stay around the duo lane. And probably when I talk about QG, because I'll talk about QG on Sunday, this is something that's really, really important because the way QG played was very much about where the jungle is positioned in the jungle relative to the laners who are pushing turret or are freezing the wave. So if you have a lane freezing the wave and there's no turret, then the jungler will be positioned such that, you know, he's near the scaling, the extended laner, right? The pushed out laner, if the laner is pushed out as opposed to the freezed one. And he's got vision up here where he's farming, or he'll have vision over here where there's a freeze. So it really varies, but those were some of the interesting things in the QD series that we might get to if they're doing their double freeze strategy again. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about with ZZR and Condi, is that ZZR is pretty good at clearing these camps, like knowing where to be in the lane swap scenario, and he'll give up some of these extra resources he can to the lane and hope that they can carry him. The other thing that ZZR will sometimes do is, because they're ahead, and he isn't really necessarily needed in the push, he'll gank mid. A lot of times, if Snake want to get a huge advantage, ZZR doesn't mind joining the push. I actually talked to him about this, and he says that he thinks that this is the biggest impact a jungler can have in a lane swap scenario, is by joining the push in a timely manner or when it's necessary to do so. So I think that this is something to talk about when you consider ZZR as a jungler. It's a lot of shit when Snake as a whole isn't really coordinated and doesn't really teamfight well, so blaming him for that on his own doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It is something else entirely, and I'm not going to really talk about Condi's pathing right now, so I'll go back. I'm not going to really talk about Condi as a pathing jungler, because for me it really depends on his pick. So I classified him as farm and gank oriented. A lot of times if WE go for a scaling comp, Condi won't do a lot of ganking, and he'll just farm. If they go for Graves, he'll just farm, which is all 3 series he played Graves today, so I think there was significantly less early game impact from WE. If he plays a gank, I really was hoping he'd play Lee Sin, so I could talk about some of the decisions he makes as a Lee Sin player, but usually what he does is he goes for skirmishers or something like this, and he just ganks a lot. And WE really lack in vision in this sense. If there's an example of this later on Sunday, maybe we'll talk about it then. So, the much more interesting series is the LGD versus M3 series, and it's only more interesting because it will answer the question of why are LGDs suddenly working? To get to that, we have to talk about kind of the personalities and the backgrounds of some of the players on LGD. Marin, right, top laner, when I interviewed Marin at the start of the season, I specifically asked him a question about adapting to a team style where Acorn and Flame received the least gank priority. Like 5% of total ganks were given to Acorn and or Flame in the LPL season. So this is just, it's not good for someone like Marin, who received like 50% of total ganks for SK Telecom T1. So I actually specifically asked him about this question, and he didn't answer it. I don't think he refused to answer it. He said something like he didn't really know how to answer it or something. So, but now you talk to PYL, you talk to people on LGD, and they talk about how they prioritize top lane ganks. Amy will go top almost all the time. This is something that happens. Wayless, in the past, his Hunter, VG Gaming CEO, has said things like he tilts. You can kind of see that in how he plays. If he doesn't get ahead, or if someone pressures his lane really hard, Wayless can tilt, and this can completely discombobulate the team, I think. I don't really know, actually, but just the idea is in place that Wayless tilts, and usually he does better when ahead. He's not really a comeback mid laner. Then you have the dual lane. The dual lane, I think, are good, no matter what the situation. PYL and Imp will have some way to find an impact. If they get camped really hard and ganked repeatedly, they'll do well in the late game. If they... Yeah, it's just weird because they don't really get behind. Ever. I don't think I've seen a game where PYL and Imp just got really behind. There was that game where they were ganked a lot, but they were still pretty even in farm, and they still did well in teamfights. So I just... I don't know, man. I mean, obviously early in the season when LGD was doing terrible across the board, LGD were still pretty bad. The duo lane didn't really have an impact because no one had an impact, but Imp was still up in farm, right? Usually. So it's... LGD's weird. LGD's bottom lane is weird. So if you're a new jungler, a jungler not used to the team or not used to these types of situations, you have to imagine that the types of personalities that this team has are all going to be very demanding personalities that ask for ganks, right? So a new jungler who comes to LGD will be kind of like top, mid, bottom, you know? And you have to learn and get comfortable with the team and know which lanes to prioritize. Do you prioritize top? Someone who's very used to having his jungle play around him. Someone who can have an impact when he's ahead, but hasn't necessarily done as well when he's behind. Do you prioritize mid? Where if Wayless isn't necessarily having a good game, he might not perform. Or do you prioritize bottom, who can do really, really well with ganks, but they don't need them, right? It looks like LGD have made the decision to prioritize top. Before, they were ganking bot a lot, or there was just no ganks, and it seemed like the jungler didn't know what to do. So to me, it just seemed like there was mixed communication, mixed signals in that regard. Either too many people asking, or things like this. Eventually, LGD have started to figure out their dynamic. In place, whatever this dynamic is, in this dynamic, you've started to see a very defined playstyle form from LGD Gaming. They really like Azir. They will early or first pick Azir whenever it's up. If they can't get Azir, they'll take Varus, usually because someone else has picked Azir, so Wayless likes this as a Varus counter. What Varus and Azir do is that they hold mid lane really well, and they push extremely aggressively. There are very few champions that push as quickly or as efficiently as these two champions. I can see him doing Lulu or something, but I don't think his Lulu play is as good overall. Victor maybe, but Victor isn't as good in the meta. So to me, these are the two champions on which LGD's playstyle hinges the most. If you don't get these two champions, you have to wonder where he'll go next, and whether it'll be as good. After this, LGD want a scenario where they can counterpick the top lane. Marin has played a very select few champions, but he's played champions that, if you notice, they counter their matchups. For example, Renekton, allegedly pretty good into Echo. So when M3's XY was playing a lot of Echo, Marin wanted to play Renekton. It's not necessarily a meta pick, but it's a pick that directly counters and has some versatility. Then you have Gnar, who's good into Maokai. Maokai's been popular, so he's been playing Gnar, even though Gnar isn't necessarily considered meta. These are all champions Marin is comfortable on, so these are champions that they'll want him to be able to pick, and they'll look to be able to let him counterpick his matchups, that he can get a big enough lead so that these champions are still really effective, even if they're not necessarily considered meta overall. These are the two main factors I think that LGD considers when picking their solo lane. They want to early pick mid so that they can get their mid lane preference, and they want to be able to leave top lane for counterpick. Their duo lane, they want PYL necessarily on a playmaking support of some kind, whatever that is. Braum, you know, pretty much, there are a lot of stuff that's meta right now that's really good for PYL. Braum is good because it helps counter some of the mid lane push if the enemy team counters it. And they love Sivir. The reason why I think they love Sivir right now is because their bottom lane is really good at by themselves getting advantages. If they get advantages like they did in today's M3 set, they can begin to invade the jungle as a duo. It used to be Wayless and TBQ would do a lot of the roams, but with Wayless holding this role of someone who constantly pushes out so they can have this jungle control, it's become Imp and PYL if they get enough of an advantage that they can take the tower and roam. So in a lane swap scenario, LGD have adapted to the point where they just can use this very well. For example, in today's second game, they took the first tier turret, they then went top as a duo lane, and they ganked for Marin. Okay, this was after Amy had already ganked for Marin, and then they set up wards and they went for collapses. Sivir's ult is really good here for this because you can collapse on pretty much anything. You can use Lucian because Lucian is highly mobile and also extremely good in lane, so very good at freeing up stuff, and you can still get picks and stuff with Lucian. Then you can even go Twitch, because Twitch is good at getting the picks. The problem with Twitch is he's not necessarily the best, strongest lane, so it'll be harder to get that early freedom. So these are some of the picks that you can use in general for LGD's strategy that they've been constructing. Again, it's a very defined strategy that's based on jungle control and pushing out waves, which has always been LGD's MO, kind of. And by jungle control, I mean compensating multiple people in the jungle, right? Multiple people in the jungle, not just their jungler having jungle control, but jungle control that hinges off of the way that PYL likes to play. PYL said that he doesn't feel like he can play his sufficient style, but they're playing it. When they get a good enough lead in the bottom lane, they play it, and that's when LGD look best. What does this have to do with Amy? Not a whole lot, but I think Amy is a significant upgrade over TBQ overall, and now that he's kind of understood the dynamic and what his role is on this team, it's looking a lot better. I still don't have a lot of faith in LGD, because I still think that if you deny the Varus, if you deny the Azir, you'll end up in a situation where we have to see a different kind of LGD, and I'm not sure they've gotten there yet. I also don't have a lot of faith in LGD in general. Some of these topsters set points also, so really strong teams can still take advantage of it, but I like this identity and I like the strategy that's forming, because it's creative in the same way that some of EDG's strategies have been creative. So we're going to talk about how Masters 3 took advantage of this, and we're able to get a small advantage based on how LGD play. First, we have the fact that Wayless is constantly pushing at the mid. So what happened is that he just kept ganking mid. That was literally the strategy that YOLO took, is gank mid. He was pretty mindful though, because he also knew where Amy was going to go. He knew Amy would go bottom, so at about the time when he thought Amy would have another set of jungle clear after getting it back, he was bottom and prepared for the counter gank. He was very able to counter Amy's gank, so I think he had a really strong sense of where Amy would path, and in general, Masters 3 probably went over some LGD VODs and knew exactly the patterns and behaviors. This kind of a Rhett-like jungle pathing that Amy seems to have is something that that probably can't be manipulated by LGD, especially if it's in the early game before the duo lane gets an advantage. And mid lane is definitely also a weakness, because if Wayless isn't able to keep pushing up and they don't have sufficient vision coverage around the river, then I really think LGD are easy to manipulate and dismantle, and if another team or jungler will apply this strategy, they won't do as well. I don't think there are a lot of teams right now that are strong enough in the late game or have strong enough players to punish this outside maybe EDG and RNG, so hopefully those teams can get it together. Or QG, obviously, but I have no more faith in QG getting anything together for the rest of the season, unfortunately. This is where I see LGD. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. More weird continuing discussion on jungling. We will talk tomorrow about all the series tomorrow. EDG play, so I get to talk about Clear Love. Vici play, so I get to talk about Danzy again. Yay! And of course, all sorts of other fun faces.